There's an open debate going on within the political left over how much to criticize the current capitalist system in society, and I think it's kind of a fruitless debate. And I'll explain why. You will never get, you will never ever get people who can agree how, to what degree the economy in the United States, for example, is more capitalist or socialist. Because if you talk to somebody, like some of the narco-capitalists or ANCAPs, as I call them, they think that basically we are already living in a socialist country. And then if you talk to some people who are further to the left, like really far to the left, like Jamal Thomas, they will look at actual examples of socialist countries, and they'll claim that's not actual socialism, which is much more common. And in my opinion, I don't know which. I don't know how you can lock those people down. You're talking about, in many cases, ideological purists. And the truth is that actually 2 days ago, I was talking to two friends of mine, both of whom I would call in some way conservative, although neoconservative. They're both pro-interventionism. They have dramatically different views of what conservatism is from mine. I'd probably be called a paleo-conservative because I don't believe in U.S. commitments overseas. And they had this kind of running argument over what totalitarian regimes could be considered left-wing or right-wing. And one of them was making the point that that's the entire issue, that neither side agrees whose totalitarian regimes belong to which side. I will go on the record and say this, okay? So my friend, let's call him Dave, the older person, claimed that the left is always afraid and calling for resistance against right-wing regimes that are in the mold of Hitler, Peron, you could say probably Marcos, dictators like that, the Shah of Iran, for example, things like that. And my other friend, let's call him Phil, decided, he said, well, in reality, okay, because the other examples, of course, the ones that the right are afraid of are Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot. He said that Peron, or actually Hitler, was a person of the left because his economic policies, if you look at Adolf Hitler's economic policies, they are not capitalist. They are not in favor of preserving the right of individuals to their private property. And why do I say that? Yes, Hitler allowed a lot of large conglomerates like Kruppwerks and Kruppwerken, I don't know how you pronounce their name in German, the BMW. a lot of these major corporations were allowed to continue to work under the German National Socialist system, the Nazis. However, should Hitler and by extension the party deem them to be not sufficiently loyal to the cause of the fatherland, they had the right to confiscate it at the drop of a hat. So there were no legal protections for private property in Nazi Germany. I'm just saying that if you're somebody out there, you're a socialist, or you might be a Nazi, I'm just trying to explain the fact that's the way it was. The Nazis did confiscate private property. I don't think that that's up for debate. And I'm not just talking about minorities. They were confiscating private property from individuals they deemed to be disloyal to the state. And that was part of Hitler's program. And people have to be honest about that. So in a certain way, Adolf Hitler did implement far left economic policies. And I would agree with my friend Phil, the second person, on that mark. Furthermore, Juan Perón and his family, his wife Eva Perón Duarte, they were both clearly socialist in their outlook. What they looked at was the inequality within Argentina's political system. Argentina had been a colonial society. You had, at the top, of course, a very well-landed class of people that traditionally were, of course, descended from the original Spanish colonists, and then of course there were a lot of Italian immigrants and whatever. And then in the hinterlands or in the slums, you had some minority groups, but in reality, it wasn't about race in Argentina. It wasn't about it was more about building a society that was on the model of either a socialist or a national socialist society. It was cooperative. So yes, Perón admired the system of Germany. But in many ways, his system many different socialist governments. I have a friend who's some of his family's assets, 2 generations ago, were confiscated by the Perón regime. Okay, so the respect for private property, once again, is one of the central tenets of being a conservative of most streams of thought. The fact that they place the authoritarian right on the right side of the spectrum, the ones that do confiscate property, I think it shows that there is no coherent right wing. So I think, for example, this is one of the reasons that I slant towards libertarianism more than many other people that I know. That I have a viewer named Pinochet that's very much for the authoritarian right, and I don't really agree with that. And I think that it's kind of a mistake for people to think that because one authoritarian system is awful, we have to do another system that corrects that's also authoritarian. I don't think it's necessary. So this article is from Medium, from Eudaimonia and Company, which is I think a big, or it's like one of the sub imprints of Medium, which is kind of a blogging platform. And I've seen, Medium is kind of going to shit because I know that they've banned a number. I think they banned Cernovich, for example. It used to be much more of an open forum. And he writes it like this. I don't know what to do. I need help. It was my little 25-year-old cousin calling me from Germany, where he was doing an internship at some company in between 2 years of grad school. Racked by frustration and despair in the States, I'd said to him simply, why don't you try going to school elsewhere and see how different life is? So here he was, figuring it out. I asked, slightly panicked, what do you mean you don't know what to do? Maybe he'd gotten involved with the wrong people on that trip to Berlin. So his brother replies, I mean, it's 5 p.m. and everybody's left the office, everyone. They insisted I go with them. Now we're all sitting here drinking beers in the square in front of this old tavern. It's like the whole city's here. I don't know what to do. So then he asks, what do you mean you don't know what to do? What's the problem? I don't. So the guy says, dude, he said, real despair, should I go back to the office? I mean, it's like everyone just leaves work at 5 and sits here in the square drinking beer and relaxing and laughing and talking about life. This isn't normal. Not normal. Are they going to fire me tonight? Maybe they just want to get rid of me. Maybe they're being nice to me because. So then he says, I laughed, suddenly, the author, suddenly understanding. None of this was remotely normal for him, born and raised in America, and raised American, New York City, Texas, Virginia, Boston. That Puritan American work ethic inculcated relentlessly into him from grade school to the Ivy League. Drinking beers at 5 p.m. in the square, nothing could be more perilous. To keep your job, that career you'd worked so hard for. Maybe even that sense of self as an industrious, self-reliant, true blue American. And so there he was, my little poor cousin, going to pieces because he was now faced with a tiny portrait of human happiness and having to fit into it. Only he'd been brought up to believe that misery was happiness, but then it wasn't. He'd been so miserable, had to leave it, and yet now, when happiness was right in front of him, it seemed to produce something like a kind of massive cognitive dissonance, sudden emotional conflict, tiny breakdown. This can't be happening. Guilt, shame, confusion, fear. That's how deeply capitalism had permeated him, but he hadn't quite registered it. LOL, my dude, I said as gently as I could. Nobody's going to fire you. This is perfectly normal for the rest of the world. It's more normal to live like this than it is not to. Americans are the weird ones. Have you been to Spain or Italy yet? You see how these guys all leave at 5 p.m. and drink and relax and laugh and relax? So let me see if he goes. I don't think he cites any real statistics here. But he goes on and gives like this real commentary. Here we go. Perhaps you think I've idealized the above for you, have I? And yet it isn't the very fear and anxiety of subsistence and survival that Europeans designed their societies to minimize precisely what most Americans find themselves overwhelmed by. 80% lives paycheck to paycheck. 70% can't raise $1,000 for an emergency. At the very same time, depression and loneliness and drug use and suicides are skyrocketing. Hardly a coincidence. The ills of capitalism have left America a battered, smoking wreck because if all you base your society on is capitalism, you're going to get capitalism's weird and terrible diseases, problems, and maladies too. And of those, the most basic is precarity because capitalism doesn't care if you live or die. It wants you caged, kept captive, not fully alive, but not really dead either. That is how you do the most work for the least price. Hence, Americans live right at the razor's edge because that is where capitalism profits most. But still, let's name more of those ills: overwork, competitiveness, acquisitiveness. So he calls competitiveness an ill. Cruelty, hostility, enmity, those have nothing to do with capitalism. Fear, anxiety, rage, stress, pressure, burnout, mistrust, distrust, suspicion, loneliness, disconnection, fragmentation. So this guy, I have to tell you, okay, let's pull up, before we get to the other country that they never want to talk about. We'll talk about unemployment in Italy. Sorry, I didn't have this ready. So until this year, unemployment in Italy for the youth was kind of out of control. But suddenly there was the big, there's an upset, not really an upset, kind of expected uh, wave in March where the populists took power. And, you know, you have this downward trend now. And it had been at around 11, see here, 11.2% up to, around 11.2% during that time period. 11.2%. So what this guy's doing, this Umar Haque is talking about is, and this is just the general unemployment. We're not talking even in Italy. So that was an issue that he's saying, well, you don't have to worry about if you have a job in Italy where you can work, until 5 p.m. and you don't have to worry about being overworked and the culture is much better. Yes, if you have one of those jobs that happen to be from that that sort of area. And by the way, don't tell me that I picked the wrong country because he cited Spain and Italy as well. Spain, which is, by the way, going through a complete clusterfuck of an economy too. I could have picked Spain as well because Spain is suddenly, its economic gains have reversed since the new socialist government has taken over. So almost 1 in 5 young Italians are neither employed, job-seeking, nor in full-time study, according to an EU-wide report released on Monday. The Italian figure of 19.9% was close to double the EU average of 11.5%, though it had seen a slight drop from this previous year's figure of 21.4%. Nonetheless, Italy is the country with the highest percentage of 15 to 24-year-olds classified as NEET, not engaged in education, employment, or training, by the annual employment and social developments in Europe reviews published on Monday. Now that was when who was governing Italy? The Democratic Party of Italy, which are social democrats. So I want to know what Umar Haque is talking about when he's saying, well, it's really the issue is that you need social democracy to temper the ills of capitalism. You actually have social democracy preventing people from being able to do anything. You have, by the way, Italy is one of the countries that, in their zest for creating that sort of welfare state, they've completely alienated entire sections of the country. You have a very industrious north, very prosperous with of course, Fiat's big factory is up there, and I don't remember where, but sorry. you have Fiat. You have a number of large corporations over in the north. Southern Italy is still kind of a neglected backwater. Most of southern Italy, by the way, is kind of one of the most depressed areas of Europe in terms of the economy. So what has social democracy done for the people of southern Italy? You can't, you had a garbage strike in Naples. you still have in Sicily, you have lots of these buildings are collapsing due to you have you have runaway corruption literally in all of these cities. But also, by the way, then Italy is one of the most corrupt societies in at least the Western world. I don't know about if you talk, let's say if you included some of the third world countries. I think Italy would probably be relatively normal, but it's generally deemed to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and it's possibly because of the society and culture of Italy. Let's not beat around the bush. So then I want to turn your attention. Yesterday I hinted that I am going to talk a bit about Venezuela, and one of the things I want to talk about with Venezuela is exactly what social democracy means. In a lot of these social democracies, you see the government, you see the state managing uh, strategic resources and industries. So that's one of the key arguments for social democracy, and it's a very it's a very easy argument to make, and I think it gives a number of points. When I lived in Israel, okay, while this is loading, I don't know why it's taking so long to load, but when I lived in Israel, I remember hearing a lecture. I don't remember exactly who it was. I think it was from the party, a person from the party that wanted to legalize marijuana, and he was saying he wanted to privatize a lot more industries apart from certain strategic industries. What are the strategic industries for a country? Let's say Israel, but let's say any of these other countries. You'd probably say the public utilities, which are electricity, water. You could say the sewage system, the police, the prison system. I think privatization of prisons is kind of I don't know if it's I don't know if there's really a case to keep it the way it is. Okay, there's a lot of people criticizing it. I'm not as familiar with it as other people are, but I'd say that it wasn't a good idea to privatize the prisons. Some people would say public transportation should be owned by the government, and I happen to think no. I think it's a bad idea, based on personal experience and people that I know that work in it. So the Citgo saga is an issue of Venezuela having when you think about countries owning an oil company, that is in many in many times depends what era it is, depends what the price of oil worldwide is, but it's almost a license to print money, and it was for Venezuela for several years. But one of the flaws of having a system, something that's publicly owned, is that nobody's responsible for when it breaks. Nobody has to bite the bullet, so to speak, when it's basically you don't own anything. It belongs to everybody, and therefore you have a lot of the now Venezuela, for example, has a publicly owned oil company, PDVSA. So does Brazil, Petrobras. I'm not sure. I don't think France does. I think Total is a private company, and ENI in Italy, I think, is also private. But there are certain countries that own public oil companies. So in the current meltdown in Venezuela, which I'm sorry, but this article is really giving me trouble. In the current meltdown, you have issues of corruption that are basically threatening the entire country's economic future due to the dependence on this one specific company. And why has it become more dependent on PDVSA than others? Because, simply put, they've scared away a lot of the other private industries. Okay, here we go. So, scroll up. Sorry. This is regarding Citgo, which is now the the U.S. based subsidiary of PDVSA, and I think it's operating out of Houston, although its technical headquarters are in Delaware. So when Petroleos de Venezuela became the sole owner of Citgo Petroleum in 1990, the state-owned oil company known as PDVSA was among the largest and most profitable energy companies in the world, the pride of a stable, long-standing democracy. With the first Gulf War looming, PDVSA touted itself as a reliable supplier of oil amid the Middle East's turmoil, ramping up crude production to meet demand as oil embargoes on Iraq and Kuwait tightened global inventories. Nearly 3 decades later, Venezuela and PDVSA are in shambles. Their oil production and revenues fast declining amid corruption and mismanagement that began during the socialist regime of the late Hugo Chavez. The future of Citgo, meanwhile, hangs in the balance as international creditors maneuver to grab PDVSA assets, perhaps none more valuable than the Houston refiner, meaning Citgo, to recover losses. At stake is not only the survival of Citgo, but also some 4,000 jobs nationwide, including 800 in Houston, where state and local governments provided a $20 million package of incentives and low-interest loans to lure the company here from Oklahoma in 2004. So you have corporate welfare from the United States to this oil company. Sorry, from the state government of Texas as well as the Houston government, which I think is a huge mistake, and that has to be, Republicans have to be held accountable for that too, because I believe, of course it's Texas. If the state was involved with that, it was Rick Perry and it would be Rick Perry and the Republican Party on the state level, and whoever the mayor is on the local level would probably be a Democrat in Houston. Ultimately, analysts expect Citgo and its 3 U.S. refineries to be sold, possibly in pieces, to satisfy the billions of dollars in claims against PDVSA and the government of Venezuela. Venezuela will likely lose control of Citgo, said Francisco Rodriguez, chief economist for New York investment bank Torino Capital. And the question is whether it's going to happen now. Venezuela is in the midst of a political and economic crisis. Food, medicine, and other necessities are in short supply, and inflation is rampant, measured in the thousands of percent. For PDVSA and Venezuela, the loss of Citgo would likely accelerate the downward spiral. Even as U.S. sanctions on Venezuela prevent Citgo from repatriating its profits, the Houston company remains a guaranteed buyer of Venezuelan heavy crude as refiners, including Phillips 66 of Houston and Marathon Petroleum of Findlay, Ohio, scale back imports. So listen to what that means. Venezuela had other customers, and because of the fact that, and this is kind of implied, Venezuela is not a reliable supplier of oil, and that was the pitch back in the 1990s when PDVSA bought Citgo. They said, well, with all this chaos in the Middle East, with all these wars, why not trust a supplier that's far closer? There's much less turmoil in Venezuela. There's much less chance that there will be delays in the oil supply. Instead, what's happened? It's actually less dependable than getting oil from Russia. It's actually less dependable than getting from getting oil from Iraq. It's less dependable than getting oil from Africa. I think off of not it might be Sao Tome, but I think it's Sao Tome. I think has some oil. Equatorial Guinea is the country I'm thinking of. So those countries, which are no real gems in terms of their public administration, are much more efficient than the country that has much more oil than they do. So really, this is an example where in the 90s, Venezuela endeavored to streamline their system, make it almost vertically integrated, where you have from the oil pump all the way to the gas pump, you could get your oil without breaking any of the supply chain. That was the intention of Citgo, and then beyond the Citgo's demand, because Citgo wasn't the only customer, you would have other companies in other countries buying Venezuelan oil. Now they're so undependable that other refiners, Phillips 66 in Houston, you could imagine that it would have been convenient because they're in the same city as Citgo, the refiner, that it would be easy for them to use the PDVSA oil. Well, it's so bad that they can't get it, so they're coming up with other places where they can receive oil. The United States also remains PDVSA's largest export destination. Without Citgo, PDVSA's already restricted access to the American market will become more limited, analysts said, further undermining efforts to keep Venezuela or PDVSA solvent and encourage foreign investment in sorry, I sound like Justin Trudeau, in Venezuela's oil-rich Orinoco region. PDVSA was one of the top oil companies in the world, says Julian Cardenas Garcia, professor who studies international oil and gas transactions at the University of Houston's Law School. This situation was unthinkable. The developments that have put Citgo at risk began more than a decade ago when the Chavez government nationalized the oil and mining holdings of foreign companies. That led to a number of companies such as the Houston oil producer ConocoPhillips to challenge the takings in arbitration proceedings sanctioned by contractual agreements and international conventions. So this was the seizing of the means of production by the Venezuelan government. They thought they could get off scot-free with it, and now those assets are being rewarded back to the private companies that Chavez thought he was going to be able to screw out of them, and it's coming home to roost. Venezuela, which sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, was then prospering as global oil prices raced toward $150 a barrel. And Chavez used that money to fund generous social benefits and support friendly regimes in Cuba and other countries. Oil prices plunged after the 2008 global financial crisis, but recovered quickly, soon cresting above $100 a barrel again. Chavez died in 2013, succeeded by his protege, Nicolas Maduro, who continued Chavez's policies. Okay, that's very important. He did continue them. It hasn't been changed very much. Venezuela devolved into political and economic crises following the collapse of oil prices in 2014, which made it impossible for the government to pay for Chavez's social programs, service its debts, and invest in the oil industry. As the economy collapsed, hundreds of thousands of people fled the country amid rampant violence and widespread shortages. The Venezuelan government and PDVSA owe billions of dollars as part of more than a dozen arbitration disputes related to the country's seizing of foreign assets under Chavez. Houston oil and gas producer ConocoPhillips, for example, last month reached a $2 billion settlement, which you've covered on this channel, with PDVSA as compensation for the 2007 seizure of two of ConocoPhillips' joint ventures. Let me see. I think we're going to have to cut it short. Let's see if I can get through this. ConocoPhillips is also seeking compensation from the government of Venezuela through arbitration pending before an arm of the World Bank. The award, expected to be determined this year, could be as high as $4.5 billion, analysts said, a tall order for a cash-strapped government. The cupboard is sort of bare as far as Venezuela's economic prowess, said Russ Dolan, CEO of investment bank Caracas Capital Markets. There is a huge amount of judgment coming down the line, and they don't have the resources to pay. So this was Chavez and his successor Maduro claimed that they were going into an economic war against the crony capitalists, the local Venezuelan capitalists like the owner of Pilar, who I don't remember his name, and as well as the foreign capitalists. And they said that they were going to liberate those funds for Venezuela. And what actually happened, a lot of people say that they took a knife to a gunfight. I came up with the stupid analogy this week of taking a wife to a nun fight. And that's what I think happened in Venezuela. These nuns just beat the fuck out of the wife, in this case, Venezuela. Sorry, I just had to say that. I thought it was very clever when I came up with it. Venezuela, unfortunately. And I do want to emphasize, I think that it's important to remember that there's real human lives here. There's people that can't afford food, that can't find, medicines. They can't find clean water. They don't have electricity. That's the result of what's his name, Umer Haque, said would be people happier in a social democracy. They still believe, by the way, many of these people believe that Venezuela is in some way more of a social democracy than a socialist system because there is still a private sector. Well, what the hell's happened here? How can they explain what happened here? They don't. They always say that it was not true socialism, or that, and I guess now because they want to avoid having to defend socialism, they want to say it's not real social democracy. Maybe they want to point to Germany, which is also undergoing a lot of resistance to social democracy. You can't have it both ways. You either represent a system and try to defend it, or you just remain in your room and play magic cards all night and let everybody else argue the real brass tacks. That's about it. Please like this video. subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the other channel, Razor Ray Live Wounds, share the video, and comment when it uploads.